Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. Bob, we're back. It's good to be with you again. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. We've had a little bit of technical difficulties here, so it's good to get those resolved.
It is. Technical is always oh man. It was really good to do that just for our listeners, kind of maybe a little bit of a touch point for them. We were able to do a seminarian event together that you guys do through the John Paul II Healing. That was just an awesome experience, I think, for all those guys that were there. They came for a month, but they did it virtually. And we were just chatting about that before we flipped on the mics about how it seems like they were really blessed by that.
Yeah, and they were really blessed by you being there, Jake. It was just really a gift to have you be a part of it this year.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's one of my favorite things is to work and serve and minister with like-minded people. It's one of obviously the things I love about the podcast, but it's cool to be able to dive in with those guys. And seminarian and priestly formation, bishop formation, it's a big part of our mutual love. So
yeah,
that's exciting. Yeah.
You got to teach next to Sister Miriam, which I know that was a joy for both of you. And
it was, yeah.
And Bart in the afternoons and Kim. And I just love what God has put together. And these guys having a month of walking into their stuff. It's unlike anything we experience is that intensive month.
It's true.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about fear today, but it's how you get over fear is to go into the depths of those places and see Jesus' love, huh?
Yeah, exactly. We're starting a new series now called Faith or Fear. There's a lot going on in our world that has to do with all kinds of things. And we just felt that this was the right topic because it's not just the current situations in our lives that are eliciting fear. Like fear's been around a long time, and that's kind of where we're gonna get to. So we're gonna start off with our quote as we always do. This is from Genesis chapter 3, verse 10, and it says, "I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid." Bob, that one line for me can capture maybe 75% of my life. Just that one sentence. I feel like in some ways, that's one of the most brilliantly written psychological phrases ever.
I agree. And, last time we talked about they were naked and unashamed.
Right.
And this is the flip side of this. That was before the fall. This is after the fall. And the Apostle John, the gospel writer, John, and wrote the epistles. He talks about fear has to do with judgment. So it's interesting. And, there's a lot of fears that we have we're going to talk about, but fear of judgment, I think, is a core for many of us. Why do we hide? Because we're afraid we're not going to be received. But there's a lot more to fear than that. But
yeah, it's one of those things, that it struck me is that in my work, I'm the kind of guy who's always trying to get to the heart of the matter. And I think it's just my personality and potentially how God's, designed me. And I love to get to the roots of why things are the way they are. And one of the things that I kept coming back to and keep coming back to my work with people, and it's just exactly what you're talking about, is that there are core desires in every human heart. And those core desires are extremely important to be aware of. And so the opposite of judgment would be acceptance or received.
Yes.
So we can make so much sense of our actions and what we do because we can understand what we deeply desire. And it was helpful for me even to say that a lot of this is God-given, right? It's not, it didn't just randomly happen. God put desires in our hearts to draw us back to himself.
Yeah, and so, to go to that quote, it's right after the fall, right? It's the immediate quote after the fall.
Yeah.
And so they have this, talk about faith versus fear. They have this great love, security, intimacy, all the desires that we all have being fulfilled. And then this thought is planted in their head by the father of lies that tells them you can't trust the father. The father's not trustworthy. So you got to make it on your own.
Oh, Bobby, what you're saying is just like fireworks going off in my mind, because so if we break down what you just said there, for me, the word faith just, I don't know, it's obviously good at whatever, but I don't resonate with it. I can't do a lot with it, I think, because it's so intellectual for me. Yeah. But the word that I can really dive into my heart is trust.
Uh-huh.
And I've learned that faith and trust are essentially synonyms. You know, if I can have faith in someone, it's because I can trust in that person. And so right when you were just saying is like the trust dynamic was broken down. And then
Uh-huh.
you were talking about the reaction that they had to the trust dynamic being broken down.
Yeah, that's so core. I mean, it's again, as we were talking about in the Theology of the Body and Healing series, this is just a continuation of that. It's just the core experiences are universal, before the fall. And so this
Yeah.
is a core experience of trust. I visited Germany, an integrated community in Germany, which is in the middle of atheism. And they had a school with all these kids that were atheists, and they were trying to teach them religion. They had to teach religion in
Mm,
school. So they couldn't talk about God. They couldn't talk about Jesus. They couldn't talk about anything that first year. So they
mm.
started with concepts like trust and honesty and
Wow.
truth. And because they could start there, they could eventually build to the gospel message. But it took them several years to build the bridge between their human experiences and the gospel. I think it's just because it's so core. Trust is so core to every one of us.
Yes.
Honesty,
Yeah.
truth, faithfulness.
Yeah. Right. Those are the things that we're made for. Those are the things that we desire. And, when we understand them, our life starts to make sense about why am I crippled right here with fear? It's because I've lost a security or I've lost a trust. For me, when I think about fear, it's such, again, my head can get in the way. The intellectual stuff can sometimes distract from the heart stuff. It's meant to serve the heart stuff. That's a whole other dynamic. I'm just having my mind like intellect's not bad. It's meant to be in a benevolent relationship with our heart, right? And very often it's not a benevolent. As Aquinas talks about the benevolent relationship between the intellect and the passions. But when I try to just boil down the experience of fear, here's how it boils down for me is it's this experience of going, it's not going to be okay.
Yeah.
And when I have that experience of it's not going to be okay, I do all kinds of things, whatever it might be, to try to then make it okay,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. The emphasis on I try to make it okay, right?
Right.
Which is where we're going to go with this is some of the response when we're in fear. Yeah. As I hear you talk about that, I think about what really happened at the fall. I mean, God predicted it. You're going to die.
Mm,
And with death comes judgment. And so those are the primordial fears that all of us live in. We have a primordial fear of death. In the book of Hebrews, it says, that's what Jesus came to heal is our primordial fear of death. And it's the last enemy to be defeated. And we have a primordial fear of the second death, which is judgment, which
mm,
is being eternally not accepted, rejected, cast out. And I think
yeah.
those two fears underlie all the other fears in some way. And it's the
Yep.
loss of relationship with God. It's the loss of that security that you talked about. And St. Thomas Aquinas actually
Yep.
defines fear as the anticipation of the loss of a good that we desire.
There's so much, I feel like, complexity to this dynamic. And I think if maybe we can boil it down a little bit for our listeners. Maybe I'm the only one who's feeling complex right now because I think I think why I'm feeling that is because fear has been such a big part of my life. And so I think maybe everybody's life, but I just don't want to generalize that across the board. But I'm pretty sure that that's the case. At least that's what I've learned in working with people and dealing with myself is that, man, fear is big. And it
Yeah.
is probably, other than trust, it's the most powerful dynamic in my life. Yeah, I
Yes.
think it's the most powerful dynamic in the universe,
Yes.
other than love or trust.
Yeah. I mean, love and trust go together. We trust where there's love, and we fear where there's a threat of the loss of love. Right.
And so that when you talk about the anticipation of the loss of a good, I know for me when I think about the anticipation of a loss of a good, what is that like? I know the experience of that as it's kind of twofold. I'm afraid of being empty, or I'm afraid of something bad being there.
Yeah.
And that's the experience for me because I get afraid of the emptiness, and so the emptiness is sometimes terrifying. And I would say that experience of emptiness or the fear of emptiness is a major player in why healing can struggle because we fear if this thing is taken away, say in addiction work,
Yeah.
if my addiction is taken away, the fear is I'll have nothing. I'll
Yeah.
have no joy. I'll have no peace. I'll have no satisfaction. And so there's the fear of being empty. And then the other kind of fear is this is where we experience in the healing world with trauma.
Uh-huh.
something bad happened to me. And so now I'm anticipating that bad thing happening again. And so now I'm on guard and I have to change my life. So does that resonate with you, the
Oh,
emptiness as well as the bad?
oh, yeah, very much. I think next time we're going to talk about the wounds, but what I think about immediately is abandonment when you talk about emptiness. And again, I go
Mm.
back to the beginning of what it must have been like to move from the total security and love with the Trinity to the emptiness of being without it. Their hearts had to be empty. Their whole experience, there was such a loss. And I think for all of us, it's a primordial experience of fearing that loss of relationship, fearing that loss of that feeling of abandonment. When I've had seasons of my life where I've been in fear of dying, uh,
Mm.
waking up in the
Yeah.
middle of the night and just
Yeah.
fearing dying. When I try to go underneath it, and what am I really afraid of? I'm afraid of being alone and
Mm.
nobody being there and feeling helpless. I'm
Mm.
not really afraid of death. I have all kind of beliefs of what's going to happen in death, but
Mhm.
I'm afraid of the loss of control, feeling powerless, feeling alone, and nobody there to help, which I think is an experience of not only emptiness but abandonment. Of I don't know what's going to happen here, and I'm not okay.
There's two quotes from the Catechism that have really helped me along the way and helped me make sense of this. And they're right in the same section early on in the Catechism. So I think maybe this will help us kind of articulate in a different way of the same thing that we're talking about. It talks about the original experience of Adam and Eve and then the fall. And so this is from paragraph 397. Man, or humans, tempted by the devil, let his trust in his creator die in his heart. Like that's
Yeah,
everything that you just said, right?
yeah,
That's the catechism. And then later on in that passage, or in that quote, it says, all subsequent sin would be a disobedience toward God and a lack of trust in his goodness.
yeah.
I think
Wow.
that to me sums it up. That sums up when I'm struggling with fear, exactly like what you were saying just a moment ago about the fear of death and all the beliefs that you have. It's really the fear of being alone. And when you keep peeling back the layers, for me, I bump into the God. Are you really there? And if you're there, do you really care about me? Because I have this fear, I have this experience that's not okay, and then I'm trying to make sense of why is it not okay? Like well, what am I going to do about it? How am I going to figure this out? Right. And that's exactly what Adam and Eve did. The enemy goes, it's not okay. And they go, what? It's not okay. Maybe he's right. Maybe it isn't okay. And then they said, now I have to do it. So
Yeah.
this lack of trust, they let it die in their heart. And that phrase of they let
Let
his
it.
trust. Yeah. Meaning
Yeah.
they cooperated.
They made the agreement with the lie of the enemy, and then it wasn't that God left them; they left God. Right? They allowed that trust to be broken, which then allowed them to believe that they were alone and that they were going to get judged and that terrible things were going to happen.
The next one later on, so that's paragraph 397. The next one is 399. Basically says the same thing, but a little bit different way. The one part of that paragraph says, they became afraid of the God of whom they could have conceived a distorted image. They became afraid of the God of whom they could have conceived a distorted image. In other words, they became afraid of something that wasn't even real. It was a distorted image of God. And they feared that. And so then they started taking matters into their own hands. Like their security was gone,
Yeah.
trust was gone because of an illusion.
I think of the acronym, right? Fear, false evidence appearing real. That's the distortion. The enemy fed them with false evidence that appeared to be real.
Right. Right.
FEAR, false evidence appearing real.
We could keep, I feel like, diving into this. And I feel like I'm ready to go, okay, what do we do? What do we do? How do we, like, um, but I think before we maybe go into the practical, I just want to, for our listeners to acknowledge, can we be honest enough to see the fear that's in our lives? There's a phrase that I'm saying a lot to myself right now. And it's something basically like, if I'm ever going to be who God designed me to be, I have to see reality as it is. Another way to put it is, if I'm going to live well, and if I'm going to live a saint's life, if I'm going to be the fullness of what God designed me to be, I have to see what's actually going on around me, not what I project or perceive. I have to see reality.
Yeah.
And sometimes the reality is way better than what I saw. And sometimes I'm avoiding something that I don't want to see. And so the only way that I'm going to work through these dynamics is to see it as it is in reality. Another way to say that would be truth. And sometimes that means I have to acknowledge I'm terrified. I'm afraid of God. And for me in the healing journey, step one is awareness and honesty. We've got to be aware of what's actually going on and being honest about what's actually going on. Otherwise, we're living in a fantasy or not reality, and you can't get traction there.
Yeah, I don't know if you experience this. I imagine you do because I think it's universal, both in my own life, but in also walking with people in therapy. I find that the more secure they become, the more they're able to face their fear. It sounds like an oxymoron, but I believe all of us have deep seated fear, part of our human experience from the fall.
Right.
And yet we live in such a way of coping, whether it's through addictions or whether it's through control or whether it's through
Hmm.
you know, material things, whatever we do to try to live in the illusion of being in control of our life
Hmm.
blinds us to the reality that we're driven by our fear. All the seven deadly sins are driven by fear. Greed is driven
Hmm.
by fear of not having enough. Pride is fear of not being good enough. They're all driven by fear. And the reality is we don't face those fears until we've grown enough. I mean, we may be paralyzed by them, but we don't face them and deal with them until we have
Yes.
a relationship with God enough to begin to realize that I'm not going to die if I face these fears. That I'm going to be
Amen.
okay uh,
Yeah.
because there's somewhere to go with them. But if I think they're true and I have nowhere to go with them, all I can do is medicate them or suppress them or run away from them or whatever.
Absolutely. You know what that makes me think of is therapy for me is this incredible microcosm of so many other things that you experience in life. And so what you're describing, it made me think about the therapeutic rapport or the therapeutic relationship, which is intended to mirror the relationship between God and his people. When we're in a helping role, we're supposed to love like Jesus. And very often, what happens for people is until they enter into a relationship where they're secure enough in and with the other, they can't face their fear. So when they do it alone, they go, nothing's changing. But then I go to therapy and then things start to improve. And the research says that one of the core principles and realities of change has to do with the relationship. The
Mhm.
relationship is the bedrock of therapeutic change. And the reason that that's the case is because that's what we're made for. We're just aligning with our nature and being and doing who we're supposed to be. And then we can start facing our fears. And when you have like a therapeutic setting where God is at the centerpiece and it has a Christian worldview, then it doesn't become primarily about the therapist and the client. It becomes about God's presence in the relationship with the therapist and the client.
Yes.
It's we're doing what he does instead
Yes.
of the therapist is the savior or whatever. And so it aligns, just like you're saying, like I can't face the fears until I know I'm secure. Well, sometimes I have to get secure with another human being because God feels too big, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And that's I know for me, that's happened a lot. I've had to have human relationships, quote unquote. And it's not like God is going, hey, that's not nice. I want that. He doesn't have like a mood issue, right? He's not like mad, right? He's okay with it.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference, and you can tell what's good therapy from bad therapy by that measure. Bad therapy is using every means possible to fix you so that you're not afraid, and I'm not afraid. Whether that's I've got to come up with some drug to make you better or some technique
Hmm.
to make you better or some exercise that you do or something,
Right.
because I don't trust God enough as a therapist to know that he's gonna meet you there, so I've gotta be the one to fix it. That's destructive therapy.
Wow, man. Oh, you just described my my inner world very often. I mean, and that if I'm honest, as a therapist, I struggle with that.
Yeah.
And it does. It comes down for me. I've examined this enough. When I'm in the therapeutic setting and I'm afraid, it's because I don't trust God to come through. And then I'm afraid of what the client will think of me. I'm afraid of the loss of reputation, the loss of potentially effectiveness, the disappointment. I mean, there's so many things, and it's true. It boils down to God, do I trust you?
Yeah.
Do I trust that you will come through? And I think that phrase for me explains so much of my life. God, do I trust you here?
Yes. It's
Yeah.
everything. And I think there's also a place when we haven't worked through our own places of fear as a therapist. We see the person struggling with the very thing that we haven't faced, and it
Hmm.
strikes this kind of inner terror of, I've gotta shut that down because I can't tolerate it." I've gotta shut it down
Right.
by fixing it, by changing the subject, by making it better, by using words or techniques or whatever it is.
Right. And, the thing I find that's really beautiful is that a technique and service and rooted and like a garden of trust is incredibly effective. A technique that's transplanted or put into the dry, rocky soil of distrust, man, they're very, very different. Because you're not saying that you can't do something in therapy like that.
No, no, not at
You're
all.
not contradicting like scientific methods that work or whatever. But what you're putting is in the heartbeat of it all. If it's rooted in fear, it doesn't work.
Right.
It's not as effective. In other words, the core dynamic here is trust and fear. And so I know for therapists, and we've been trained in the therapeutic world, these dynamics are touchy. Like these are intense dynamics for a lot of therapists because they just go, hold on, but the research says, but and we go, yeah, yeah, totally. We're not denying the research, but what we're talking about is the human person that transcends a therapeutic intervention.
Yes.
And when you get to that transcendent dynamic of the human person, trust in the Lord is greater than cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is probably the most common, popular thing that everybody says is the most well researched, blah, blah, blah. And the irony of CBT, just for a moment, I think is really funny, is it's essentially at its heart, it's pursuing truth.
Uh-huh.
That's essentially what it's trying to do is get truth in the room, which
Yeah.
is a person,
Yep.
not
And
just an idea.
and challenging the false evidence that appears real with the truth that can give us a sense of security. So I was thinking about toxic fear.
Qualify that because we were talking about it earlier. Like Aquinas talks about because there's healthy fear and toxic fear. So maybe give us some
Yeah.
background there.
Yeah, to go back to St. Thomas Aquinas and then St. John Paul II, because they both had a lot to say about fear.
Yeah.
So St. Thomas Aquinas says, when we fear something that's good, losing it, there's
Yeah.
a healthy emotion of fear. It's an indicator. And so right now we're living in this pandemic,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of things that are being threatened in our life. Fear of death, fear of
Hmm.
loss of health, fear of loss of family members, fear of loss of income, loss of jobs, loss of opportunities, loss of social relationships, fear of being alone. There's a lot of fears that are coming to the surface.
Hmm.
If we ignore those fears, we're going to go into toxic fear, which I'll get to in a second. But if we ignore them, it's at our peril. It doesn't solve our fear, it increases it. So what do? We feel the fear that's there, and rather than try to fix it ourselves or medicate it or run away from it or all the things we do to cope, we bring that to God. And we have this deeper security in Him, which allows us to transcend the loss into something that's more stable, more secure, greater. And when we have that security, we can face these fears. When we don't have that security, we can't. And so John Paul II, from the very beginning of his pontificate, be not afraid. When you look at his life, he lost his mother, his sister, his father, his brother. He had the Nazis coming to try to kill him and his friends. He was losing friends constantly. And then the
Yeah.
communists came in to take over. I mean, if anybody had a reason to be afraid,
No kidding.
so where did he come with that statement? He came through dealing with fear his whole life, right? The fear of
Yeah.
losing everything that was important. And he had to, he was required because of those things to press into God in a deeper way. And thank God he had godly parents and a godly community around him, but to
Mhm.
press into God in a deeper way. So God was not a concept to him. God was a living reality of a relationship where he was secure. And so he could say, no matter what's happening around you, be not afraid,
Mhm.
because in God we trust. Not
Mhm.
to be trite with that, but there's
Yeah.
a trust there that's deeper.
Two things come up, Bob, as you're saying that. The first one, it's kind of just a silly image that popped into my head that I never thought about. Because you're saying earlier, if you avoid the fears, it just makes them worse. And I had the image that everybody talks about is putting your head in the sand.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, what happens when you put your head in the sand is you get underneath the surface And that's where all the fears are. So if you put your head in the sand, you're getting more into the fear of what's underneath the surface. So that was one thought is, yeah, don't put your head in the sand. That'll make it worse. Just face the reality of the fear. Yeah, you're going to have to open it up anyway. But yeah, sorry, I was sitting there going, wow, I've never thought about that, because we talk about getting underneath the surface is necessary. I can't even remember the second one because now I have this weird image of an ostrich putting its
Yeah,
head in the
that's right.
sand.
And they leave
Yeah,
themselves vulnerable, right?
right, exactly. Yeah, and they're actually what's underneath the surface of their heart, because that's really, it's a heart dynamic. If we
Yeah.
avoid our heart dynamic and we quote unquote put our head in the sand, it just makes it worse, right? You're right, exactly. You're more vulnerable.
Yeah.
Maybe the analogy doesn't make sense at all, but anyway.
No, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah. So, Bob, how about let's talk a little bit here as we start to wrap up this episode. You were talking about, in God we trust, and you were talking about with John Paul II, that it's his trust in God. And there's a scripture that has always stuck with me because I understand his experience, and it's Peter when he gets this accolade of saying in response to Jesus after in John 6, where they talk about the Eucharist, and and Jesus turns and says to them, the close 12, "Do you guys want to leave too?" And then Peter says, "Well, where else am I going to go? You have the words of eternal life." I think everybody's kind of like, there's like this hidden angelic applause that comes out as after Peter said it, "Yay, he got the right answer." And I don't feel like that's what happened, because the experience and maybe I'm projecting my experience onto Peter, but if I was in that moment and I said those words, because I've said those words, this is the place that it comes from, is, God, I have really tried to find life apart from you. I really have. And I've given a sincere effort. Like, I've tried sin, I've tried vanity, I've tried gluttony, I've tried lust, I've gone through them all, and they don't work.
Uh-huh.
And if I'm honest about the reality, they don't work. And so then my response is, where else am I going to go?
Yep. That's
Like,
good.
when I'm honest, I'm left with the reality of either I trust you are who you say you are, or I am done for,
Yeah.
because all these other things don't work. And that's me trying to be honest about my experience. Like, I've tried really hard. I have, about all the other things. And that's what I still struggle with, right? Like, say, gluttony, for example. It works really nicely for about 20 minutes, but then you wake up the next morning and then you just go, I feel terrible.
Yeah.
And after you get over 40 years old, you start to show it, right? Like, you can't have the bag of potato chips and then all of a sudden just go, wow, everything's great. Like, you wear your fear and gluttony.
Yeah.
So I really resonate with that, with Peter, of just going, Lord, where else am I going to go?
Yeah.
And it's not for me a cheering phrase. It's a phrase of just the reality. And so what that then asks of me is for me to really assess my relationship with God, because where else am I going to go? Like, what else is there?
Yeah.
Like, nothing else makes sense in my life. I know no other antidote to fear that's actually worked in my life other than you. If I'm honest,
Yeah.
you're the only thing that's ever worked. So I have to now start to deal with my faith in you and my relationship with you.
Yeah, that's
You
good.
know,
What you're describing is toxic fear, is all the things that we try to do to control fear on our own, to take care of that emptiness inside,
yeah,
to fill the emptiness. And it's toxic because it doesn't work. It
yeah,
keeps us stuck in the fear. And then when we come to the end of that, people that don't know God, you come to
yeah.
the end of those things, and everything now is terrifying and empty. And why do people commit suicide? Because they're
I
afraid.
was thinking the same thing.
They're afraid that everything that they've tried hasn't worked to get back into control of their fear. So if somebody's listening to this and you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, recognize the problem isn't that life doesn't work, or that it's not going to be okay, or that things are hopeless. It's that you've been trying to cope with fear in a way by being in control of it, and you're recognizing you're powerless. So you're looking for the ultimate control, which
Mm,
is, I can take my life and not suffer here, as
mm.
opposed to bringing that suffering to God and wrestling with Him, because it's not easy when you're in that place.
That's true.
Wrestling with Him and trying to establish that trust.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We
That
have
was some,
practicals.
yeah, some practicals.
I think one of them that a couple that we've already described is being honest. about the reality of our situation. Because that's what you were just talking about there with people who might struggle with suicidal thoughts and suicidality is that's just such an intense. I can remember clients. I have so many stories of walking with people and that, and every one of them, they were terrified. They were absolutely terrified. And so I think a few practicals come up is one, being honest about the fear. The only way to face the fear is to be honest about the fear. And then beyond that is recognizing what we're made for, recognizing the deepest desires of our hearts and where do those actually get satisfied. So I long to not be abandoned, right? I long for connection. That's just what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm.
Where am I going to go for that kind of connection? And that's why the value of relationship with God and with other people. So for me, the practical that this turns back to, and I feel in some ways redundant because I feel like we almost talk about it every episode, but it's an examination of my relationship with God and my image of Him and how I see Him. You know, if I have a distorted image of God, like the Catechism says, fear is going to be very hard to process through.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an examination that can happen of where did I learn the God that I'm relating to? And is that actually God? And where did I learn that from? And so often it comes from experiences in our lives where we've learned Him from a false image or someone who reflected Him falsely to us. And then no wonder we're afraid.
Yeah, no
because
wonder.
we're not even relating to the real God.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
point. So, what I would say as a practical is name the fears and then take them to God. But as you're describing, what if I don't feel safe to take him to God or don't believe that he's there? Then what do I
Right.
do? And I would say
Right.
a practical in that situation is we've all experienced somebody in our life that's shown us the face of God. Who is that person
Yeah.
or those people? And so just to think about bringing those fears to that person, and obviously that person's human, they can't solve the fears, but just the ability to share fear with somebody else, which is a lot what
Oh,
happens
that's
in
so
a
true.
therapeutic relationship. Just
Yeah.
naming the fears with somebody who's not going to judge you or condemn you, think you're weak because you're afraid. The reality
Absolutely.
is it takes strength to be acknowledging your fear.
So true. When you said that about acknowledging it, Ignatius's rules of discernment are very, very big in our lives. And you're describing some of the latter part of the first set of rules or the first set of the 14 rules. And so one of the things that Ignatius encourages us to do is to actually bring it into the light. I think it's like 12th, 13th, or 14th rule where he talks about like when you acknowledge the dynamic that's going on straight on, it fades away quickly. But
Mhm.
when you don't acknowledge it straight on, it has permission to stick around and it kind of lingers. And he says this thing like there's no enemy greater than the enemy of human nature when you don't actually face the dynamic that's going on. So you're essentially what I'm hearing you say is bring it into the light by sharing it, by talking about it with someone.
I think there's a common experience, is having a dream where you're running from something. Have you ever had those dreams where
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah.
running away and you're terrified as you're running? But in
Right.
the dream, if you ever stop and turn around and face the thing you're running away from, the fear just disappears. I think
Yeah.
that's an expression of what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's the 13th rule is where he talks about don't keep it in secret, but reveal it to it. And the next one from Ignatius is the 14th rule. What I found really helpful, another practical with fear, is when I examine the fear, it's very helpful because it shows me where the enemy attacks me. And so the
Mhm.
14th rule talks about an army analogy, and basically wherever the enemy attacks you is showing you where you're weak. Not just generic. I have to fill in the blank with fear of blank. I've got to fill in that blank. And then I have a really good sense of where the enemy's attacking me. And what happened in my life and people I work with is that there's always experiences around those fears.
Yeah. That'll be a great lead into our next session talking about the deadly wounds, because that's where the fears are going to bring us back into looking at those wounds and where those wounds come from and how do we meet God there.
Amen. Let's pause there. So thanks for listening. And you can find our podcast on iTunes or other places that you find podcasts, or you can go to our website. You probably already know how to find our podcast because you're listening to it, but maybe a friend doesn't know, and maybe a friend hasn't heard of it, and you might want to send it their way. And you can send them to iTunes. You can send them to our website, which is restoretheglorypodcast.com. And on that site, you can sign up and get the emails every other week when our podcast release coming right to your inbox. Our desire is that God would bless you, And our desire is that God would heal you. And our desire is that God would remove your fear and that the perfect love that he offers to us would come into your hearts. And that's our desire for you, that you would experience the abundance of God's love, mercy, and healing.